Okay, our next speaker is Jay Cost. And Jay Cost is a columnist for the political magazine The Weekly Standard, a former writer for Real Clear Politics, and an expert on elections and the US presidency. He's the author of Spoiled Rotten: How the Politics of Patronage Corrupted the Once Noble Democratic Party and Now Threatens the American Republic. And his latest book, which releases 3 months from today, you can pre-order it on Amazon.com, is called A Republic No More: Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. And it's a historical look at the growth of government and how it's undermined the Republican principle embedded in the Constitution. So please welcome Jay Cost.
Thank you very much, Professor Harold, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and happy Veterans Day to everybody. And a bit of a change of pace here. If Justin was talking about overarching executive power, my talk is going to be more about executive impotence. And this week I was talking with Professor Harold about, what should I talk about? Where are we going to go with this? And so here we have a symposium on the presidency just a week or so after a midterm election. And I have just now completed a book about American political corruption. And so Professor Harold suggested, well, wouldn't it be great if you can combine all of this into a single talk? Oh, is that all? Oh, no problem. Well, thanks a lot for that, Professor Harold. And if you stay around for the Q&A afterwards, I hope to discuss French symbolist poetry as well, so look forward to that. But no, kidding aside, I'm happy to be given such a weighty mandate, and I hope to do it justice. And I'm going to sort of start by just introducing my hypothesis, and we're going to run through it here. I'm going to argue that our government today, at least in matters of domestic politics, behaves irresponsibly. That we expect our president to impose responsibility on our system, but given his place in our system of government, he is usually incapable of doing that. So, we the people are left perpetually disappointed in government, but really the fault doesn't lie with the president, it lies with us. We have to come to rely less on fictitious ideals of presidential superheroes and focus more on the hard, unglamorous work of citizenship in a republic. So let me start with my thesis up front here. Let me now go on and define some terms. Particularly, what do I mean by the concept of responsibility? I mean it in the sense that the framers of the Constitution might have meant it. That is a government that executes the will of the people in a fair and impartial manner. And put another way, a responsible government would react to, say, last week's election results by implementing the program that the victorious candidates campaigned on, and they would do nothing more, nothing less than that. But our government is irresponsible, which is to say it doesn't do that. It's irresponsible in two different ways. The first way is that fresh elections regularly yield nothing but gridlock. Indeed, that is the typical result of elections. It's actually a supreme irony of our democracy that the American people vote for more offices than probably any other people in the history of the world. We are saturated with democracy in our country, from president all the way down to local dog catcher. And yet, at least on a national level, our democratic institutions seem incapable of yielding satisfactory results, at least most of the time. This, of course, is exactly what we will see over on the federal level over the next 2 years. And of course, in the last week, there was some happy talk about congressional Republicans and President Obama working together. But nobody believes that. I mean, they don't even believe it. And this is, of course, despite the fact that poll after poll shows people wanting our elected officials to work together. Please work together to solve our big pressing problems. And we'll probably see something similar here in Pennsylvania as well. So we just have a new Governor-elect Wolf, who's a Democrat, coming into office, won by 10 points in the face of a nationwide Republican wave. But he nevertheless confronts a Republican legislature. But really, more than that, a Republican legislature that doesn't have a lot to worry about in terms of losing its majority status. So the best bet there is there probably will be more room for compromise on the state level, but gridlock will probably be the rule of the day in Harrisburg as well as Washington. So that's the first way our government is irresponsible. In other words, we the people want and beg our government, please solve these problems, and it doesn't do it. The second way that our government is irresponsible is a way that I understand and I define as political corruption. And that is any case where the government treats people differently based on their financial, their social, or their political advantages, right? James Madison, who was founding father of the Constitution, integral in developing it, called this the violence of faction, right? Playing favorites, using public resources to help particular interest groups or pressure groups, or even to line your own pockets. All of this runs contrary to the ideal of a Republican government, which is one where people are supposed to be treated equally and fairly. And as I argue in my book, this is actually a problem, in my estimation, that's gotten worse, not better, over the course of our country's history. And again, this is despite the fact that we vote for more offices than ever before, and more people than ever before are eligible to vote. All this democracy, all around us, where everybody is given a vote regardless of their social, economic, or political status, and yet our government is prone to play favorites based on those very factors. And this irresponsibility frustrates the public. Frustrates me, of course. It was a very frustrating book to write. And more often than not, people are prone to point the finger of blame at the President of the United States of America. He's the guy in charge, right? Why can't he go up to Capitol Hill, crack the whip, get those numbskulls in line, and make everybody behave themselves? Why can't he clean the special interests out of government? Why can't the President make government responsible to the people that vote for it? And the answer I have for you, unfortunately, is not an uplifting one. I could say, be hopeful and say, yes, this is what the President can potentially do, and we, the people, have to do a better job of electing men or women who are capable of doing it. I might also say that our particular president is now a lame duck, but there will be a new president in 26 short months, and he or she will be able to turn things around, so we just have to be patient. Those would be the optimistic ways to look at it. Those would be the ways to suggest that 2016 is an opportunity for a fresh start and governing responsibly. But I don't really see things as being that way. I think that's optimistic, but unfortunately not true. Here's the truth as I see it. Our president cannot make our government behave responsibly because it's not his job. It was never meant to be his job. The problem is, in fact, with us. We, the people, have come to expect far too much of him. In fairness, presidents over the years, particularly since Woodrow Wilson, they have encouraged us to raise our expectations, to believe that the president is capable of these things. Presidents usually run for election promising you that they can make the government behave responsibly, and when times are going very well, when it comes time to re-election, they usually take credit for that, suggesting it was something that they did. So they want to create that impression. But it's a false one. It's a false impression. And the fact is that our expectations of the commander-in-chief, at least as regard to domestic politics and policy, are simply too high. And this sort of blind hero worship of the presidency has reached extreme proportions in recent years. 2008 was a particularly absurd example. The undertone, and in many cases the overtone, of the Obama candidacy that year was, here was a man who was so special that by the very force of his personality, he could change the way Washington works. Now, he never really offered any particularly concrete ideas about how he was going to do that, mind you, but he left it up to our imaginations to sort of put the pieces together and see him as an agent of change. And Republicans, and myself included, rolled their eyes at what we thought was a silly spectacle. But then again, we are just as prone to irrational exuberance when it comes to the commander-in-chief as well. Speaking as a conservative and the son of Ronald Reagan voters, the grandson of Ronald Reagan voters, and even a friend and colleague now of former Reagan administration officials, I have to say that Reagan idolatry on my side has reached just as absurd proportions in the last couple years. Ronald Reagan, in my opinion, was a good president, but conservatives have remembered him wrongly as a kind of presidential Superman, and then they apply that standard to evaluating future occupants of the White House. So, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, it's all the same. We falsely mythologize the power of the president. We falsely idolize occupants of the Oval Office. We expect too much of them, and we are left inevitably disappointed. To put this into perspective, say, ask yourself, how many truly great presidents have we had? How many fit the model that we have for the occupant of the White House? I would suggest that in terms of, you think through that model and what we expect in presidents. We've now had 43 presidents, if you count Grover Cleveland only once. And I would say there's really only been one who fits that model, which is Abraham Lincoln. Every other president falls short of that ideal. And every other president was never as powerful as we usually think of the ideal president. Or otherwise, if he was that powerful at one point in his term, he lost that power years before he left office. Even George Washington, who was a fine and good president, but his second term was marked by political divisions and not a lot of progress on domestic issues. Even Franklin Roosevelt, again, a fine president, but if you look at the second half of his second term and all of his third term, there was very little progress on domestic issues, and in fact, he had to deal unsuccessfully in many cases with a conservative opposition. Only Lincoln, who is in most respects an exception to the rule. There's really no reason to generalize from the example of Lincoln, because here was a president who was in charge exclusively during wartime, when the president's powers are at their greatest. Moreover, it was a civil war, so almost all of his political opposition had bolted the government, and on top of that, he was killed before his second term really even got started, so he too might have ended up disappointing us. So why can't our president make our system of government behave responsibly? Well, recall I outlined two different types of responsibility. First is making the government do what the people want it to do, and second, making sure it treats people equitably, not to play favorites. So let's take each of these in turn. So to begin, why can't the president just make the government, quote unquote, get stuff done, just like people want? And the reason gets back to a simple fact. Our government was never designed to be so easy to manipulate, to make it work. It was never supposed to be that easy. And even then, the president was never supposed to be the person to make it work that way. It's important to understand here the context, the political and social and economic context of the Constitution, and particularly the perspective of James Madison, who was, coming together, he and his fellow framers in 1787, coming together after, about 5 years of having had no war against the British. They defeated George III, and they had instituted something on the American continent that had never been seen before in modern history, a government where only the people rule. In England, government had actually been a balance between the monarch, the clergy, the nobles, and the people. In America, we got rid of all of that, except the people. It was only the people. And in the 1780s, it was an epic disaster. Really, I cannot understate just how terrible government was in the 1780s. Back then, the states were the main place where government happened, and they were as reprehensible as they were democratic. They abused political minorities, they fought with each other, they allowed foreign governments to play one off of the other, they violated the treaty rights of former loyalists, they made a wreck of their public finances. It was terrible. And the Constitution has to be understood, at least in part, as a way to deal with these excessive and exquisitely democratic governments. And so what the framers did was really quite ingenious. They didn't reinstate the natural social divisions that existed in the British government. The British government was a representation, at least those who celebrated it, saw it as a representation of the natural social divisions within British society. Again, you had the people, you had the monarch, you had the clergy, you had the nobility. But our founders didn't create a monarchy, they didn't create a nobility, and they didn't give ministers special veto rights in the new Constitution. They didn't do any of that. They retained this idea that sovereignty flows directly from the people at large and only from the people at large. But they implemented this concept of dividing power, similar to what exists under the British system. And they did that under the belief that this was a way to prevent tyrannical majorities from wreaking the kind of havoc they had during the 1780s. Put it another way, whereas the British Constitution used natural divisions within society to balance the system, the framers created artificial distinctions in our government to check and balance one another. All power would continue to flow from the people to the government, but it would flow in different ways to different offices in different intervals. So the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years and is dependent upon population. The Senate is elected every 6 years. Every state gets a guarantee of 2 senators, so therefore it tends to favor lightly populated states. And it was originally to be selected by state governments rather than the people. The president is elected every 4 years, originally by the Electoral College and not the people. And the courts are totally unelected. So as public opinion shifts over time, we should expect our government to reflect these shifts and in turn to render gridlock. And the idea being that factious or fleeting majorities could never acquire enough power to do what they did in the 1780s. So to appreciate how this works, let's think about the government that's in place right now. Let's think in particular about the Senate. The Senate that's going to be seated starting in about 2 months. So a third of this Senate was elected in 2010, which was a good year for conservatives. A third of the Senate will have been seated in 2012, which was a good year for liberals. And a third of the Senate will have been seated in 2014, or elected in 2014. Another conservative year. The public, over these last 3 elections, have shifted back and forth. So is it any wonder then that the Senate is not going to be capable of getting a heck of a lot done? It reflects those shifts, and it indeed possesses within it a memory of those shifts. There are some senators who were elected with the Tea Party wave in 2010, and they're going to reflect that. There are senators who were elected in the Obama resurgence in 2012, and they will continue to reflect that. And now there's a new class of senators who were reelected in an Obama reaction. The Senate is going to reflect all of that, and as such, it's going to be a muddle. And that's just the Senate. That's just the Senate alone. The House has its own peculiar rhythms, and so also does the presidency. And then on top of that, political power has to be shared between the 3 of them, and each possesses really a decisive veto over the rest of them. This is the way our system was designed. The idea is that if the public actually wants our government to do something, and it is good for the country as a whole rather than a fleeting majority, then sooner or later, the government will come around to that idea. If it's just a temporary impulse, say, Obama or Tea Party, if it's just something temporary and fleeting, those voices will certainly have a place within government, but it will not be strong enough of a position to drive public policy. And the idea of strong presidential leadership as a way around the sort of intractable roadblocks of our constitutional regime, it's an attractive concept. But even the strongest president is constrained by this structure. Yes, the president can enter office riding high on a wave of popular support, but if that wave ebbs by the first midterm, he will confront new opponents who view their purpose in Congress as one of thwarting him. And maybe he'll bounce back and win re-election, but typically that happens in such a way that it's hard to recreate the original magic. So his opponents get re-elected too. And then another 2 years in, he usually gets even more opponents. And this is what happened with Barack Obama. And as a matter of fact, if you look at, there were 5 presidents in the 20th century who were elected to 2 full terms: Clinton, Reagan, Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Wilson. All 5 of them experienced more or less the same thing. In other words, our system makes it hard for the people to change the course of government, to move the policy needle in a certain direction. Really, to make change happen, you have to vote for change 3 times in a row. And let's think a little bit more about these votes that we cast. You know, I mentioned at the top of my talk here that the country seems united around this idea of let's get the government to get things done. Okay, that sounds great. We all agree the government should get things done. But what kind of things? Well, there's not nearly as much agreement on that, is there? And when we start getting more and more specific about policy, we start disagreeing more and more. Think, for instance, about the economy and the government's role in the economy. Overwhelmingly, Americans think that the government has a responsibility to help the economy grow. But how? Well, half the country wants tax cuts, the other half wants more spending. And then among the tax cut crowd, half of them want to cut corporate taxes, the other half wants to cut personal taxes. The spending crowd, like some of them, emphasize spending on infrastructure like labor unions, and then green groups emphasize spending on green technology. And that's just on the spending side. There's even less agreement on how to pay for all these newfangled ways to stimulate the economy. And the more you drill it down, the more the people are not so much united in support of getting things done, but really divided about how to get that stuff done. And our government ultimately resolves this by doing nothing. And there is little in the office of the president that can change that. Yes, sometimes the president does possess a mandate for change, but usually those mandates are fleeting, and they're gone. They tend to disappear years before a presidential term expires. So what about this second concept of responsibility, that of treating people differently, concept of irresponsibility? Treating people differently based on their social, economic, or political standing. Favoritism, factionalism, corruption. Why can't the president stop that? As I argue in my book, the primary problem with corruption is not the presidential office. It is really with Congress. As an institution, the powers of Congress have been expanded dramatically beyond its capacity to use those powers in a fair and impartial manner. The book that I just finished develops an elaborate theory that I'm not going to detail here, but I will say this. When the framers designed Congress in 1787, they intended it to implement a discrete number of powers specifically enumerated by the Constitution. Today, we expect Congress to legislate on just about any subject, the only limitation being what the Constitution explicitly prohibits. That is a total inversion in the original scope of congressional authority. Now, conservatives will argue that this is a bad thing. Liberals will argue that this is a good thing. I'm not really interested in that debate here. My point, though, is that we have expanded dramatically the capacity of Congress, but we have not really redesigned the institution. By and large, with a few exceptions like the direct election of senators, it is the same institution that existed in the first Congress in 1789. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Congress was built to do the things the framers intended it to do, and by the way, in a pre-industrial society where oftentimes it would have been easier to travel to London by boat than to travel to Charleston, South Carolina by land from Boston, a disconnected pre-industrial society with little infrastructure, little sense of national purpose. That was the Congress of 1789. And since then, we've dreamt up all sorts of new things for Congress to do. But we've never redesigned it to do those things well. That's like taking a two-story suburban house out here in Moon Township and deciding to add 150 floors on top of it. That would be insane. The whole thing would collapse on its own weight. You'd need to totally redesign and expand the foundation. And yet, we've sort of done something like that with Congress. Speaking specifically, there are three broad categories of power we've added to Congress's plate, some of which are hinted at in Article 1, some of which not so much. The first is to develop the national economy, to help grow the economy. The second is to regulate it for non-economic goals like clean air or clean water. And the third is to provide social welfare, to smooth out the inequality that a private economy creates. In other words, we increasingly expect Congress to have control over the social and economic fate of the whole nation. That is leagues beyond what the framers considered back when they wrote the Constitution and designed the legislature. And yet Congress as an institution is still basically the same. It's as localistic as it was back then. You might even say it's parochial. There is nobody, for all of the national powers that Congress possesses, there is nobody in the legislature who is elected by the country at large. There's nobody whose electoral victory in the next campaign depends on working for the good of the whole country. There's nobody. Every member of Congress is elected by just a portion of the public, and more often than not, it's a tiny portion. Is it any wonder then that Congress uses these vast powers in ways that pay off tiny factions within society? That it treats people unequally based usually often upon political, economic, or social considerations? I'm not sure we should expect anything else from a Congress built the way it's built, possessing the powers that it possesses. And what can the president do about this? What are his constitutional powers over the Congress? Well, he's two by and large. He's the power of moral persuasion, and he has the veto pen. Neither of these is particularly effective. Persuasion depends on his standing in the broader country. So the idea is you have the people behind you as president. You can get Congress to do things it wouldn't otherwise do. But as I argued before, the people are quite regularly not behind the president. Presidents come in with big, gaudy mandates that are more often than not disappear 2 years in. And most presidential terms last 8 years. So that's for every 8 years of a president, we get 2 where he does have power and 6 where he doesn't. That's not a very good ratio. The second power the president has is a formal one that's embedded in the Constitution itself. Persuasion is not, which is why it ebbs and flows. The second power is the power of the veto. And this can be an effective instrument in theory, but it is terribly blunt. And think about the appropriations process that Congress has every year. Embedded within each of a dozen or so appropriations bills that amount in the hundreds of billions of dollars, there's indefensible payoffs to all sorts of special interests. Well, what is the president supposed to do with this? Veto the entire bill? Risk shutting down the government? Thwart, months of work by Congress? That would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Most presidents play it safe and avoid defying Congress. And in fact, the one president in the modern era who really tried to take on Congress was Jimmy Carter. And for his trouble, he was primaried by Ted Kennedy, he lost in a landslide by Ronald Reagan, and has since been remembered as an inept and failed president by pretty much everybody else. So why bother? Presidents often ask that question, and they don't have a good answer. So what then, in conclusion? Are we doomed to a government that is perpetually irresponsible? The president cannot generate responsibility, so we're sunk? Well, I would say no, we're not doomed to anything. What we need to do as a people is understand the duties of citizenship in the way that the framers understood it. We expect the president to take care of the knuckleheads up on Capitol Hill, but we forget that the framers thought we, the people, should do that. And too often we don't. And to be sure, plenty of Americans are good citizens who do the hard, necessary work to try to keep government responsible, but too many Americans don't do that work. Instead, they implicitly operate under the assumption that they'll vote for a president every 4 years, and that guy will take care of the hard work. And that's not how our system was designed to function. We have to do a better job, we the people. If we want an end to government gridlock, we have to give the government clear indications about how to break that gridlock. So we have to think hard, not just about the problems, but how to solve them. We have to debate one another to try and come up with a consensus. We have to figure out how to pay for this. And even that might not be enough. Even then, it might not be enough because we're such a broad, diverse country, we might just disagree. And elections can produce mixed or muddled mandates. That means we got to try again. And we have to keep doing it again and again and again until we reach a consensus. The job of a citizen in a republic is hard, demanding, and unglamorous. But it's integral. And the same goes with corruption. If we want the government to stop playing favorites, we have to keep a closer eye on what it actually does. And we have to pay attention to the unglamorous, unsexy, boring, dull, mind-numbing subjects that they often use to pay off favored interest groups, like farm subsidies. I have never seen congressional perfidy on the scale I saw when I did research on farm subsidies. And you know one of the big reasons why? Because farm subsidies bore everybody to death. And that's where they take advantage of it. And we, the people, we don't even pay attention to it. After the Constitutional Convention was finished, Benjamin Franklin was said to have been approached by a woman who asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got? Is it a republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." And there is a lot of wisdom in Franklin's conditional reply. The duties of Republican citizenship cannot be outsourced, not to a president, not to anybody. If we're unhappy with the way our government is gridlocked or it's corrupt, we can't blame the commander-in-chief. We can't blame anybody but ourselves. Because for all of changes in society since 1789, one core feature remains. There are no mixed estates in the United States government. All power flows from the people, and that means it's up to the people to make sure that power is exercised responsibly. The president has an important role to play in our system. He's in charge of foreign policy. He's a leader of a party. He is a veto pen, but he cannot spin straw into gold. He cannot turn water into wine. He's not Superman. He's not Jesus. He's not Caesar. He has his limits, and he cannot make the government function properly all by himself. And in fairness to the president, that is not his job. That is our job. Thank you very much for your time.